"Get him out of here." The words cracked across the room like a judge's gavel striking polished wood. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. The grand conference room on the 42nd floor of Harrison Legacy Holdings suddenly felt smaller, tighter, charged with tension. Richard Whitmore stood at the head of a long mahogany table, his tailored gray suit spotless, his expression full of certainty. He pointed toward a man seated quietly near the back wall. "This meeting is for family," Richard said. "He doesn't belong here." A few uncomfortable glances moved through the room. No one challenged him. No one asked questions. They simply looked at the man Richard was talking about. Marcus Harrison sat alone in a black suit with a white dress shirt and a simple tie. No expensive watch. No entourage. No attempt to draw attention to himself. At 42 years old, he carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. Yet in that room, filled with relatives, executives, and advisors gathered for the reading of Charles Harrison's final will, he looked almost invisible. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago stretched toward the horizon beneath a cloudy afternoon sky. Inside, the atmosphere felt far colder. Richard adjusted his cufflinks and shook his head. "I don't know who invited him, but he needs to leave before the attorney arrives." A few family members nodded. Others exchanged whispers. One woman leaned toward her husband and quietly asked if Marcus was a driver. Another guessed he worked in building security. Nobody recognized the last name. Or maybe they never expected the man carrying it to look like him. Marcus remained seated. His hands rested loosely on the table in front of him. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't even react. The silence seemed to frustrate Richard even more. "Did you hear me?" Richard demanded. "This is a private family matter." Marcus slowly lifted his eyes toward him. The room waited. For a second, it seemed as though he might answer. Instead, he simply returned his gaze to the documents resting in front of him. That response, or lack of one, sent a ripple through the crowd. Richard laughed sharply. Unbelievable. Around the room, confidence was growing. Most of the family already believed they knew how the afternoon would end. Charles Harrison, founder of a multi-billion-dollar empire, had passed away 3 weeks earlier. Today would determine who inherited control. Richard had spent years positioning himself as the obvious successor. He spoke like an owner. Walked like an owner. Expected everyone else to see him as one. And sitting quietly in the corner was the last thing he wanted to see before the reading began, an unfamiliar black man wearing the Harrison name. The clock on the wall ticked closer to 2 o'clock. The attorney had not yet arrived. Richard straightened his posture and smiled at the room. "Don't worry," he said confidently. "Once the lawyer gets here, this misunderstanding will be cleared up." Marcus looked out toward the skyline beyond the glass. His expression never changed. Because unlike everyone else in that room, he already knew exactly what was about to happen. The room settled into an uneasy silence after Richard's confident declaration, but it was not the silence he imagined. It was the kind that gathers before a storm, quiet on the surface and restless underneath. Marcus Harrison remained exactly where he was, seated near the far end of the conference room while conversations resumed in cautious whispers around him. The polished glass walls reflected the city skyline, and the afternoon sunlight painted long shadows across the floor, yet Marcus seemed untouched by any of it. He sat with the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime waiting for people to reveal who they truly were. Across the room, Richard accepted handshakes and approving smiles from relatives who already viewed him as the future leader of Harrison Legacy Holdings. Every gesture carried certainty. Every word suggested ownership. He spoke about the company's future as though the decision had already been made. Several family members listened eagerly. Others nodded simply because it was easier than questioning the narrative. Meanwhile, Marcus remained the subject of speculation. A woman near the window quietly wondered whether he worked for one of the attorneys. Another guessed he might represent a charity named in the will. A younger executive searched his memory, convinced he had seen Marcus somewhere before, though he could not place where. None of them connected the pieces. None of them imagined that the calm man sitting alone might be the most important person in the building. Marcus noticed the looks. He noticed the assumptions. He always did. They were familiar. 20 years earlier, he had walked into a corporate boardroom as the youngest executive in a regional manufacturing company and watched people mistake him for support staff. 10 years later, investors had questioned whether he truly owned the businesses carrying his name. Success had changed his circumstances, but it had not erased the reactions. The faces changed. The assumptions remained remarkably consistent. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth and disappeared just as quickly. He was not amused. He was simply unsurprised. Near the entrance, an assistant named Emily Carter reviewed documents on a tablet while waiting for the family attorney to arrive. She glanced toward Marcus several times. Something about him seemed familiar. Not his face. Not his posture. His name. Harrison. The realization sat just beyond reach, like a memory refusing to fully surface. Before she could think further, Richard's voice cut through the room once again. "Once Mr. Parker arrives, we can finally move forward," he announced. "My uncle built something extraordinary, and it deserves strong leadership." The statement earned another round of approving nods. Marcus slowly turned his attention toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago. Thousands of people moved through the streets below, unaware that an entire room full of wealthy individuals was making the same mistake at the same time. He checked the silver watch on his wrist. 2 minutes until the attorney's scheduled arrival. 2 minutes until years of assumptions would collide with reality. And as the room continued treating him like a stranger, Marcus remained completely still, because unlike everyone else gathered there, he did not need to guess how the story would end. The second hand on the wall clock moved with steady precision, yet the atmosphere inside the conference room grew heavier with every passing second. Richard Whitmore seemed to mistake the silence for agreement. He stood near the head of the table, speaking more boldly now, as though the future had already been signed and delivered in his name. "The company needs stability," he said, pacing slowly. "Charles built an incredible legacy, but leadership is not something that can be left to chance." Several relatives nodded immediately. Others followed simply because it felt safer to agree than to challenge him. The conversation gradually shifted from speculation about the will to assumptions about who would control Harrison Legacy Holdings by the end of the afternoon. Richard welcomed every assumption. He spoke about expansion plans, executive restructuring, and future investments. He spoke like a man introducing his own administration. Across the room, Marcus Harrison listened without interruption. His expression remained unreadable. The confidence surrounding Richard reminded him of something he had learned years earlier. The loudest person in the room was rarely the one holding the most power. Emily Carter continued reviewing documents near the entrance. The more she looked at the attendance list, the more unsettled she became. Her eyes moved from the digital file to Marcus and back again. There was something important she was missing. She could feel it. A senior family member named Eleanor Whitmore leaned toward Richard. "Are we certain the attorney is bringing the final version today?" she asked. Richard smiled. "Absolutely. We spoke last week. Everything is moving exactly as expected." The confidence in his voice seemed to reassure some people. It had the opposite effect on Emily. She noticed something unusual in the records. Certain pages were restricted. Certain names required authorization she did not possess. Most surprising of all, one of those names appeared to be Marcus Harrison. Before she could investigate further, another relative looked directly at Marcus. "Excuse me," the man said. "Who exactly are you here with?" Several faces turned toward him. The room seemed eager for an answer. Marcus slowly met the man's gaze. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be," he replied calmly. "Nothing more. Nothing less." The answer created more confusion than clarity. Richard laughed softly. That is not really an answer. Marcus returned his attention to the skyline beyond the glass walls. The city stretched for miles beneath a pale afternoon sky. Thousands of offices. Thousands of decisions. Thousands of people rushing toward goals that mattered deeply to them. Yet at this moment, the most important decision concerning the Harrison Empire was about to unfold inside this room. Richard folded his arms. You know, if someone belongs here, they usually do not have to convince people. A few relatives chuckled politely. Marcus did not react. That seemed to bother Richard more than any argument could have. Confidence thrives on resistance. Silence leaves it nowhere to land. Emily suddenly stopped scrolling. Her eyes widened slightly. A notation hidden deep within the file had finally appeared. It was only a brief reference, but it changed everything she thought she understood about the meeting. Before she could process it fully, the conference room doors opened. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. The family attorney had finally arrived. William Parker entered the conference room carrying a leather portfolio that looked almost as old as some of the company buildings under Harrison ownership. The conversation stopped immediately. Even Richard Whitmore straightened his posture. William had served the Harrison family for more than 3 decades. He had witnessed mergers worth billions, inheritance disputes, economic downturns, and leadership transitions. His presence alone carried authority. He greeted several relatives with brief nods before moving toward the front of the room. Yet something unusual happened. Instead of immediately taking his place at the head of the table, his eyes moved across the room as though searching for someone. The atmosphere shifted. Richard noticed it first. William was not looking at the executives. He was not looking at the senior family members. He was looking toward the back of the room. Toward Marcus Harrison. For a moment, nobody understood what they were seeing. William's expression softened slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough to suggest recognition. Respect. Familiarity. Then he continued walking without explanation. Richard forced a smile. Good to see you, William. We are ready to begin. William nodded politely but did not answer right away. Instead, he placed his portfolio on the table and reviewed the room carefully. It felt less like an attorney preparing to read a will and more like a pilot checking every instrument before takeoff. Emily Carter stood frozen near the entrance. The notation she had discovered moments earlier kept replaying in her mind. She looked toward Marcus again. Suddenly the missing pieces began fitting together. The restricted file. The special authorization. The unusual references. She felt a chill move through her chest. Richard leaned forward. I think everyone is eager to hear the final instructions. William slowly removed several documents from the portfolio. We will begin shortly, he replied. His voice was calm and measured. Then he looked directly toward Marcus. Only for a second. But Emily noticed. Marcus noticed. And somehow Richard noticed too. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face before disappearing. One relative raised a hand. Before we start, could we confirm attendance? William glanced down at the list. Attendance has already been verified. Richard smiled confidently. Excellent. Yet Emily could no longer remain silent. The discovery sitting in front of her felt too important. Too significant. She carefully approached William and quietly showed him a page on her tablet. William examined it for several seconds. Then he looked toward Marcus again. This time the reaction was impossible to miss. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Not in surprise. More like confirmation. As though he had just verified something he already expected to find. Around the room, whispers began spreading once more. People sensed that something was changing, even if they could not yet explain what. Richard attempted to regain control of the atmosphere. Well, he said with a confident laugh, I suppose there are no more mysteries left. The statement hung in the air. William slowly closed the folder in front of him. Actually, he said, his voice cutting through the room with remarkable clarity, I believe there is one very important mystery that several people here have completely failed to notice. Every eye turned toward him. And for the first time all afternoon, Richard Whitmore looked genuinely uncomfortable. The room seemed to hold its breath after William Parker's statement. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the distant hum of traffic beyond the glass walls felt muted. Richard Whitmore forced a smile, but it no longer carried the confidence it had only minutes earlier. I am sure whatever confusion exists can be resolved quickly, he said. William did not immediately respond. Instead, he organized several documents with deliberate care. Every movement appeared calm, controlled, and purposeful. The silence unsettled the room more than any argument could have. Emily Carter remained near the attorney's side, her pulse racing. The information she had uncovered continued replaying in her mind. She now understood why certain files had been restricted. She understood why certain names carried unusual protections. Most importantly, she understood why William had looked toward Marcus the moment he entered the room. Across the table, several relatives exchanged nervous glances. The certainty that had filled the room earlier was beginning to fracture. Richard sensed it. He leaned forward and attempted to regain momentum. Before we move any further, perhaps we should address the obvious issue, he said, looking directly at Marcus. Some people here still do not know why he is attending a private family proceeding. A few heads nodded. Others avoided eye contact. Marcus remained seated. Calm. Silent. Unmoved. The reaction only seemed to irritate Richard further. You know, Richard continued, most people would explain themselves by now. Marcus slowly looked at him. His expression carried neither anger nor embarrassment. It carried patience. The kind of patience that comes from knowing time is working in your favor. For a brief moment, the conference room disappeared from his thoughts. He remembered another room many years earlier. He was 21 years old, standing in a university conference center after earning honors in business administration. A donor had mistaken him for event staff and asked him to clear empty coffee cups from a table. When Marcus politely explained that he was one of the students receiving recognition that evening, the man looked genuinely surprised. Not hostile. Just surprised. That memory had stayed with him. Not because it was unique. Because it happened again and again throughout his life. Different rooms. Different people. Same assumptions. Marcus returned to the present as Richard's voice cut through the silence once more. If this meeting concerns family legacy, then family should be the priority. The implication was obvious. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. William finally closed the last folder in front of him and folded his hands. His eyes moved slowly around the room. Family, he said quietly, is exactly why we are here. Richard smiled, believing the statement supported him. It did not. Emily could see it. Marcus could see it. William's tone had changed. It carried the weight of a man preparing to reveal something significant. The room felt different now. Smaller somehow. More fragile. Every assumption made during the afternoon seemed to be balancing on a narrow edge. Richard straightened his tie and glanced toward the clock. He wanted the reading to begin. He wanted control restored. He wanted certainty back. What he did not realize was that certainty had already left the room. And as William slowly opened the final sealed document resting before him, the future everyone thought they understood moved one step closer to collapsing completely. William Parker rested his hand on the sealed document and allowed the silence to settle over the room. It was no longer the silence of confidence. It was the silence of uncertainty. Every person seated around the table could feel that something important was about to happen. Richard Whitmore shifted in his chair and attempted another smile, but it looked forced now. The room that had felt firmly under his control only minutes earlier was beginning to slip away from him. William slowly stood. The movement immediately captured everyone's attention. For more than 30 years, he had represented the Harrison family. He was not a dramatic man. He did not enjoy spectacle. Which was precisely why every person in the room paid attention when he chose to stand instead of remain seated. He opened the final document and carefully adjusted his glasses. "Before I read the instructions left by Charles Harrison," he said, "there is a matter that must be addressed." Richard folded his arms. "What matter?" William looked around the room. "The matter of assumptions." Several people exchanged confused glances. William continued. "For the past hour, I have listened to conversations in this room. I have heard speculation about leadership. I have heard opinions about inheritance. I have heard people decide who belongs and who does not." His voice remained calm, but every word seemed heavier than the one before it. Nobody interrupted. Nobody wanted to. Emily Carter watched Marcus from across the room. He remained completely still. His calmness now felt almost extraordinary. Most people would have defended themselves by now. Most people would have argued. Marcus had done neither. William slowly turned his attention toward the back of the room. Toward Marcus Harrison. The movement was subtle, but it changed everything. Richard noticed it immediately. So did everyone else. "Mr. Harrison," William said respectfully. Several heads snapped toward Marcus. The title alone created confusion. Respect. Recognition. Familiarity. Things nobody had expected. Richard laughed nervously. "Surely we are not stopping the meeting for him." William's expression never changed. "Actually, Mr. Whitmore, the meeting cannot properly begin without him." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of disbelief spread through the room. One executive quietly lowered his pen. A family member near the window sat forward in her chair. Emily watched faces change one by one. Confusion became concern. Concern became realization. Not complete realization. Not yet. But enough to make people question everything they thought they knew. Richard's voice tightened. "I think we are all missing something." William nodded. "Yes. Most of you are." Then he closed the document and stepped away from the head of the table. Instead of remaining near the front, he walked directly across the room. Every eye followed him. Every conversation disappeared. He stopped beside Marcus Harrison and extended his hand. Marcus rose calmly and returned the handshake. The room froze. William's next words were delivered without drama, without raised volume, and without hesitation. "Before we discuss who will inherit responsibility for the Harrison legacy, everyone in this room should understand one simple fact. The man many of you spent the afternoon questioning is not here as a guest." A chill seemed to move through the conference room. Richard stared without blinking. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Because for the first time all afternoon, the truth was standing in plain sight. No one spoke. The conference room seemed frozen between two versions of reality. In one version, Richard Whitmore was still the future leader of Harrison Legacy Holdings. In the other, that future had already disappeared. William Parker stood beside Marcus Harrison and allowed the silence to do its work. He had spent decades in boardrooms and courtrooms. He understood that some truths arrived more powerfully when people were forced to sit with them. Richard finally found his voice. "What exactly are you trying to say?" His confidence was still there, but cracks had begun to show. William turned toward him calmly. "I am saying that many people in this room spent the afternoon judging a man before understanding his place in this family." He opened the final document and lifted a single page. Charles Harrison anticipated this possibility. In fact, he addressed it directly. Every eye followed the paper. Every face waited. William read carefully. "To my family, business partners, and successors. If you are hearing this, then the responsibility of protecting our legacy must pass to the person I trust most." The room grew even quieter. Richard leaned forward. Several relatives exchanged nervous looks. Emily Carter could feel her heartbeat in her ears. William continued. That person is my grandson, Marcus Harrison. The words landed with extraordinary force. A woman near the window covered her mouth. An executive who had spent the entire afternoon ignoring Marcus suddenly stared at him as though seeing him for the first time. Richard blinked twice. Then a third time. The statement did not fit the story he had been telling himself. William continued reading. Marcus has demonstrated judgment, discipline, and leadership beyond anything I could have hoped for. Therefore, I leave him controlling authority over Harrison Legacy Holdings, including all voting rights associated with my ownership interests. The room erupted into whispers. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just stunned disbelief spreading from chair to chair. Richard stood abruptly. That cannot be correct. William lowered the document and looked directly at him. It is correct. Richard shook his head. There must be some mistake. Marcus finally spoke. His voice was calm. Measured. Unhurried. There is no mistake. The room fell silent again. William nodded. The man many of you questioned today is not simply a member of the Harrison family. He is the controlling heir to everything represented in this room. The sentence seemed to remove the remaining air from the conference room. Marcus did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply stood beside William with the same quiet composure he had maintained all afternoon. That composure suddenly carried a different meaning. People were no longer looking at a stranger. They were looking at the future owner of the company, the primary heir to the Harrison estate, and the individual Charles Harrison had personally selected to continue his life's work. Richard slowly sat back down. For the first time that afternoon, he had nothing to say. Around him, assumptions were collapsing one after another. The mystery William had mentioned earlier was no longer a mystery. The heir had been in the room the entire time. The only reason nobody recognized him was because they never expected power to look like Marcus Harrison. The conference room remained silent long after William Parker finished reading. It was the kind of silence that arrives when reality moves faster than pride can follow. The skyline beyond the glass walls had not changed. The city below continued moving as it always had. Yet inside the Harrison headquarters, everything was different. Richard Whitmore stared at the documents in front of him as though a second look might produce a different outcome. It did not. William calmly distributed copies of the estate summary around the table. One by one, family members reviewed the pages. Every document confirmed the same truth. Charles Harrison had left controlling voting rights, executive authority, and stewardship of the family holdings to Marcus Harrison. There were no hidden conditions. No alternative interpretations. No last-minute surprises waiting in another folder. The decision had been made long ago. Richard cleared his throat. There must have been discussions I was not included in. William looked at him evenly. There were many discussions. Mr. Harrison participated in most of them. The statement triggered another wave of stunned reactions. Several executives immediately began connecting pieces they had missed. Meetings held privately. Strategic decisions announced without explanation. Corporate acquisitions completed through entities that had seemed unrelated at the time. Suddenly those events looked very different. Marcus had not been absent from the company's future. He had been helping shape it. Emily Carter watched the realization spread across the room. Faces that had once dismissed Marcus now studied him with a mixture of respect and embarrassment. The transformation was remarkable. Nothing about Marcus had changed. The suit was the same. The calm expression was the same. The only thing that had changed was what people knew. An elderly relative folded her hands and quietly shook her head. Charles saw something in him that the rest of us failed to see. Nobody challenged the observation. Nobody could. Richard looked toward Marcus. For the first time all afternoon, there was no confidence left in his voice. You knew this entire time. Marcus nodded once. Yes. And you said nothing? Marcus glanced around the room. Nobody asked the right questions. The answer landed with quiet force. William allowed a small smile to appear. Around the table, several people lowered their eyes. The memory of earlier comments suddenly felt much heavier. Assumptions that had seemed harmless now sounded careless. Judgments that had felt certain now appeared foolish. Marcus did not criticize anyone. He did not remind them what had been said. He did not need to. The room remembered perfectly well. William closed the final folder and placed it on the table. As of today, all transfer provisions become effective. The sentence marked the end of speculation and the beginning of reality. Control of the Harrison legacy now rested exactly where Charles Harrison intended. Richard leaned back in his chair and stared out toward the city. The future he had imagined was gone. Not stolen. Not lost through unfairness. Simply never his to begin with. Across the room, Marcus remained composed. There was no celebration in his expression. No victory lap. Just responsibility. The room had spent hours deciding who belonged. Now the truth had decided for them. And every person present understood they had witnessed more than an inheritance. They had witnessed the collapse of assumption and the triumph of character over perception. For several moments, nobody moved. The inheritance meeting that had begun with certainty now ended with reflection. Afternoon sunlight stretched across the conference room floor, casting long shadows between the chairs and across the polished table where so many assumptions had been made. Marcus Harrison looked around the room and saw something he had not seen when he first arrived. The whispers were gone. The dismissive glances were gone. The certainty that some people belonged while others did not had disappeared. In its place was understanding. Not perfect understanding. Not complete understanding. But enough to change the atmosphere. William Parker carefully gathered the remaining documents and stepped aside. His role was finished. The truth no longer needed a messenger. It could stand on its own. Richard Whitmore remained seated, staring at the city skyline beyond the windows. The disappointment on his face was real, but so was something else. Perspective. For the first time all afternoon, he seemed willing to examine the assumptions that had brought him to this moment. Around the room, family members quietly organized their papers. Nobody rushed toward the elevators. Nobody seemed eager to leave. The meeting had become something larger than a legal transfer of authority. It had become a lesson. Marcus slowly stepped forward. Every eye turned toward him. He had remained silent through most of the afternoon, allowing others to reveal themselves through their own words. Now the room waited to hear his. He rested one hand lightly on the back of a chair and looked around at the faces before him. Some appeared embarrassed. Some appeared thoughtful. A few looked inspired. Marcus spoke calmly. My grandfather spent his life building something that would outlast him. The room remained silent. Many people think leadership begins when someone receives authority. He taught me that leadership begins long before that. It begins when nobody is watching. It begins when there is no title attached to your name. Several people lowered their eyes. Marcus continued. Today was never about proving who I am. The truth does not become stronger because someone believes it. And it does not become weaker because someone doubts it. The words settled gently across the room. Nobody argued. Nobody needed to. Marcus glanced toward the skyline one final time. My grandfather did not leave me wealth. He left me responsibility. William Parker smiled quietly. Emily Carter felt a chill run through her arms. Even Richard slowly nodded. Marcus looked back at the room. The legacy we protect will not be measured by buildings, investments, or balance sheets. It will be measured by how we treat people before we know their titles, before we know their influence, and before we know what they can do for us. The room fell completely still. The lesson was impossible to miss. Marcus had entered as a stranger in the eyes of many people. He left as the leader chosen to carry the Harrison legacy forward. Yet the most powerful thing about the day was not the inheritance itself. It was the reminder that dignity does not come from status. Respect should never depend on assumptions. And true power rarely needs to announce its presence. With that, Marcus turned toward the conference room doors and walked forward, carrying not the weight of victory, but the responsibility of a legacy that had finally found its rightful steward.